Chapter 5 Mina. Yes, Master Disciple Adriana asked without looking up. She was seated at her desk, her brow furrowed and her chin propped up on her hand as she scanned a diagram. Her tone was curt, but no more so than usual. Apologies, Master Disciple, Mina replied, bowing in deference, as she stepped into the study. I didn't mean to disturb you. Adriana pried her gaze from the diagram, coming back to the present as she pulled the spectacles off her face. Oh, that's quite all right, she said, flapping her hand Mina's way. I doubt I'll make sense of all these schematics tonight anyway. She rubbed her eyes, pulling a face. Adriana was one of the most renowned scholars in the Order, and her knowledge of stargazing technology was unmatched. But even she had to rest sometimes, Mina supposed. The Master Disciple frowned as she sat up, peering more closely at her visitor. Are you all right? You look troubled. Mina stifled a wince, thinking of Darcon. He'd gotten in a few good hits against the other boys, which was a victory in itself, but she doubted that would do much to ease the blow to his pride. Watching him be defeated again, and doing nothing had given rise to a wave of guilt she hadn't been expecting, and although the other initiates were eating now, she wasn't hungry. What she needed was a distraction, and she planned to seek one in the library. But first, she needed to reserve a time to use the telescope. Although she had her own spyglass, it didn't offer the same views, and her constellation scroll was in desperate need of checking. After her conversation with Elder Sloak, she had every intention of keeping it up to date. I'm fine, Master Disciple, Mina replied. I just got caught up in something. Visiting with Sloak again, the ghost of a smile appeared on Adriana's fair face. I shouldn't be surprised. He needed someone to help him eat, Mina replied, clasping her hands in front of her. He's been having difficulty swallowing lately. She wasn't sure why it felt so important to her to spend her free time with the Elder. Perhaps it was the idea that no one should slowly fade away, as he was so obviously doing. Or maybe she just wanted to give some comfort to someone she knew wouldn't be around much longer. Indeed, the Master Disciple sighed, her face falling. It's a tragedy, really. The wisest man in the Order, and now he can no longer feed himself. She shook her head, absently shuffling some papers on her desk. His story illustrates how important ascension is, evading death and the indignities that come with it. It is the biggest insult that can ever be wrought against the god of darkness. That's the most valuable lesson you can learn from the elders here. Leaning back in her chair, she crossed her arms. There are some here who might be cross with you for frittering away your free time with Sloak instead of practicing. But as it stands, you should be proud. Breaking stone is no small feat, Mina, and at your size... Her smile was back, a full grin this time. I bet those bureaucrats at the conjury would tear their hair out if they knew what you accomplished back there. Mina kept her gaze steady, color creeping into her cheeks. She had heard as much about the conjury as anyone, but although its presence extended all over Heavenfall, she had yet to encounter a representative or visit an outpost. All she knew was what she had been taught as a girl, that the conjury put the money in magic. They were responsible for setting and collecting the taxes on spellcasting, from glyphs to charms, to hexes to conjurings. Those taxes, so they claimed, were what kept the world running, kept the cities in repair, and kept the criminals behind bars. More to the point, however, they kept magic out of the hands of the so-called undesirables. If you wanted to spellcast, you had to pay for it. Mina didn't doubt that if it weren't for the religious exemption, they would be collecting their dues from the temple too. I owe it to Master Disciple Lennox, Mina replied, recalling the sweet taste of power she had felt standing before the stone. And as for the free time, if you think I should be practicing more... Master Disciple Adriana held up a hand. Hardly. That's Lennox's purview. I just manage the observatory. Speaking of which, she pushed her diagram aside and set her logbook down in front of her with a heavy thud. I imagine you're here about telescope time. Yes, Master Disciple. The senior disciples and elders were familiar with the device's mechanisms, of course, but given the intricacies of its construction, initiates were forbidden from using it unsupervised. One jammed gear or cracked lens would render it non-functional. Sliding her spectacles back up her nose, Adriana thumbed through her roster. It's been a while, hasn't it? Since last year, Mina agreed. The time we took the day off to study the midsummer eclipse. Of course, Master Disciple Adriana said with a brisk nod. Too long, I would say. You're in luck. It's available this evening, assuming the weather breaks. The clouds always block out all the good stuff. She folded her hands on her desk. At any rate, I'd say you've earned it, after your success at the tournament. Mina blinked, her eyes widening. That would be an honor, she replied. She had planned to spend the evening scouring the sacred text, but this was a rare treat, and a welcome distraction after what happened with Darcon. Master Disciple Adriana picked up her quill and scrawled a note in her register. I can't promise anything groundbreaking, she cautioned. In fact, with this cloud cover, you probably won't see much of anything. Still, if you're there at just the right time, you might get a good view. She nodded toward her office door. Go fetch your sextant and your volvel, and don't forget your constellation scroll. I'll meet you back here in an hour, and we can see if the storm has moved out. Yes, Master Disciple, Mina said, bowing. Thank you. I'll be there. She backed out of the office, bowed again, just for good measure, and scurried into the hallway, filled with renowned zeal. Watching the lethargic movements of the nebulas and star clusters was an experience like no other, and there was always the possibility of spotting a celestial dragon. Stargazing had never been transcendent for her, like it was for the other pupils, but perhaps that was about to change now that she had finally connected to Celestriona. If nothing else, this eased her worry about being cast out of the order. Why else would they bother to let her use the telescope? Part of her felt guilty that she would get to do something like this, while Darcon was stuck outside practicing forms. Still, not even that was enough to dull her excitement. She picked up her pace as soon as she was out of sight of the mechanist, rounding the corner and hurrying outside. She kept her stargazing tools in her room, just beyond the enormous silo that housed the telescope, and she wasn't about to dawdle when there was an opportunity like this on the line. The dormitory hallway was as bleak as they came, all cold stone and drafty corridors, but that barely registered. What did register, however, was the bearded man standing idly outside Darcon's cell. Mina almost didn't see him at first glance. The stranger was leaning against the wall, nearly vanishing into the shadows. She would have walked right past him if it weren't for his eyes. They gleamed out of the darkness, bringing to mind the image of a cat waiting in the gloom for some unfortunate rodent to come skittering past. They reflected the light of the surrounding lamps, like mirrors as they flashed in her direction, and Mina came to an abrupt stop. He doesn't belong here. He wasn't dressed right, clad in mud-spattered leathers and a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm weather, and most blatantly of all, a sword hung at his hip. Questions flitted through Mina's mind. How did he get here? What is he doing here? Why is he outside Darcon's room? She settled on the simplest one as his eyes landed on her. Who are you? The man stared at her for a moment, like some kind of skulking apparition, before stepping out of the near darkness. He was younger than she'd first thought, no more than 25, if she had to guess. His hair was shaggy and dark, falling around his shoulders, and framing deep-set eyes under a heavy brow. There was something else, too. A patch of mottled skin on his neck that peeked out from under his collar. Burn marks, like the scars that had covered her mother's forearms when she spilled hot oil on herself back in 10 Keeps. Just a messenger, the man replied, smiling, his eyes drifting briefly back to Darcon's closed door. A messenger? The man nodded. I had a letter for Darcon. Mina raised her eyebrows. I don't remember him mentioning he was expecting a message. Well, the stranger replied, I brought him one. His hand came to rest idly on his sword hilt. There was a long moment of silence, the only sound the wind outside battering the ancient building. And it occurred to Mina that she hadn't seen any other initiates in the dormitory. They were all in the dining room. Her fingers twitched, but she said nothing, sizing him up. Finally, the man spoke again. It was from his twin brother, Bragon, he explained. He wanted to write back to him. I told him I would wait out here to give him some privacy. Mina relaxed. So he was a messenger then. Darcon had mentioned Bragon in the past, but they hadn't had much contact over the previous months. The Augurist tribes were nomadic enough to be hard to contact, even without their guided distrust of outsiders. It was what made them so difficult for the conjurer to sanction, despite their flagrant disregard for the magic tariffs. You say Bragon wrote to him? She asked, tilting her head to the side. Something about this situation was tickling the back of her mind, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. I bet Darcon was happy. He's always hungry for news from the outside. Come to think of it, so am I. The man gave her a nod, replying, Then I feel like I've done my good deed for the week. There was another pause. It doesn't hurt that I'm getting paid, either. Mina bit the inside of her lip. I probably shouldn't bother him, she thought, but visitors were rare here. She did sometimes wonder about her family and whether their situation had improved. The most frustrating thing about temple life was the isolation. Not from her family, but from the outside at large. Elder Sloke always joked that if the world ended, the Order would be the last to know, or to care, just so long as the heavens went on moving. What's the word then? She asked, unable to resist trying her luck. From out there, I mean. The stranger's capacity for friendly chit-chat seemed to be at an end. He straightened up, his eyes returning to Darcon's door, and crossed his arms, replying, Look, kid, I'd love to tell you, but I'm not in the business of giving out handouts. I'm a messenger, not a gossip. News, like letters, requires money. Mina swallowed, flushing a little, and looked away. That's okay, she said, pressing her lips together. I can't really afford any news. The man hesitated when he saw her reaction, his expression softening a little. He cleared his throat. I'll give you this one for free, then, he said, pausing to think for a moment. It's not exactly big news, but you might find it interesting. The Council of Dragons has officially declared gold dragons extinct. That's pretty common knowledge, Mina replied, a little disappointed. Sure, the messenger replied defensively, but it's official now. They've only just made the declaration. He returned to playing with his sword hilt, and Mina couldn't help but wonder if he was compensating for something. How many species does that make now? She asked. She knew she needed to be getting along, but she remained glued to the spot. Something about this whole thing was still nagging at her. It was on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't quite reach it. The Corer raised his eyebrows. Extinct species, you mean? Mina nodded. Oh, platinum died out 1,000 years ago, he replied. Then there were rubies, a couple 100 years ago, give or take. No one's seen any golds for at least 5 years, and now they're on the records. That makes 3 lines gone. You forgot about diamonds, Mina pointed out. That seemed to startle the Corer, and a strange look crossed his face. Confusion, mixed with a hint of unease. I swear I've seen one. Are you sure? It was probably a quartz. Well, he said, regaining his footing. I didn't exactly get close enough to scratch it with glass. Thanks, Mina said, nodding. So here's my news for you. Darcon should probably hurry up with that letter. They're wrapping up in the dining hall, so if he wants food tonight, and he will, he better go get some soon. The man nodded once. Will do. Mina turned away from the Corer and strode the rest of the way down the hall. 2 minutes to collect her tools from her cell were all she needed, and then she was off again, peeling away from the row of rooms and rushing back into the courtyard. She was halfway to the observatory when she finally realized what it was that had been bothering her during her conversation with the stranger. It was as cold as a cave in the initiates' dormitories. But the messenger had been sweating. Chapter 6. Seth. Seth's eyes didn't leave the small initiate as she retreated down the hallway. His heart was in his throat, sweat standing out on his temples as he strained against the burning of his tattoos and the nervous tension that threatened to overtake him. He was struck by the overwhelming urge to run, to tear out of the dormitory, through the gates, and back down those infernal stairs, never to return to this place again. That, of course, wasn't an option. There was no running from your own skin. Instead, he was left to watch the girl until she disappeared around the corner at the end of the hall. Only once she was out of sight did he allow his shoulders to relax, but he could do nothing to quell the pounding in his chest. He had to get moving. Assuming it had worked, the glyph would keep Darcon sleeping for 10 minutes. Given the delay in getting rid of the girl, that left him around 8 minutes to do what needed to be done. 8 minutes. 480 seconds. More than enough time if he played it right. Turning to Darcon's door, the thaumaturge gave it a push to see if his suspicions were correct. Sure enough, it was locked. The boy must have bolted it behind him. That wouldn't be enough to stop Seth. Drawing from the reserves of energy stored in his tattoos, he released some of his pent-up magic, channeling it down through the arms and out of his fingertips as he performed the series of intricate motions his parents had taught him all those years ago. The memory struck him unexpectedly, an old wound freshly reopened, a sadness welling forth from it like blood. Gritting his teeth, Seth pushed the thought away and concentrated on the spell, mumbling the incantation in the silence of the hallway. Moments later, the shadow of his hand, projected on the wall by the flickering lamplight, was no longer connected to his body. It seemed to shift and pulse, breathing like a living thing as it began to slither down the doorway. It ended abruptly at the wrist, its fingers ghoulish and spindly as it crawled to the ground, bending weightlessly to a 90-degree angle as it detached itself from the surface of the door. It now lay flat on the floor, as smooth as paper, where it remained for a moment, as if considering its next move. Seth furrowed his brow, twitching one of his fingers. The shadow hand replicated the movement where it lay on the ground, its long finger wiggling in a perfect mimicry, or mockery. Flattening his hand so that it was parallel to the floor, Seth pushed his arm forward, and the shadow disappeared into the gap under the door. He closed his eyes, casting his senses out past the corporeal and into the ethereal. The tingling of the magic was there in his fingers, but when he focused, really focused, he could feel the distant sensation of cold stone on his palm, tile snagging against his skin like crooked teeth, the floor of Darcon's cell. And then, as he twisted his wrist and fell upwards with his fingers, there was the roughness of iron, the door. Walking his hand upward, Seth could sense his shadow do the same on the other side of the door. He took a step closer as he felt for the interior latch. If Darcon had been awake, he surely would have called out upon seeing the spidery patch of darkness that was now creeping up his doorframe. But there was only silence on the other side. A good sign. 460 seconds. It would have been more than enough time if it was only a matter of the scroll, but there was the box in the observatory to worry about as well, and that meant he couldn't afford to dawdle. Seth froze when he felt cold brass at his fingertips. Manipulating the shadow to slide the bolt free was tricky, like writing with the wrong hand, and the effort of maintaining the spell soon had his eyes stinging with sweat. Somehow, though, he managed it, praying to any god who was listening that the girl wouldn't return. When he had at last undone the latch, he pushed the door open and let go of the spell, watching as the spider hand floated leisurely through the air to reconnect with the rest of his shadow. Upon stepping inside, Seth found Darcon slumped on the floor of his cell, his legs splayed out in front of him and his head hanging forward against his chest. The backless wooden stool lay on its side beside him, and Bragon's letter had fluttered to the ground, unfurled and unread. Making sure to close the door behind him, lest some unsuspecting initiates wander by, Seth strode over to the desk. Darcon's constellation scroll was still open for study on the table, a prize just waiting to be snatched up. The thaumaturge grabbed it, admittedly rather gracelessly, but he had other things to worry about than a few creases. Folding it up into a messy square, he slid the magical parchment under his jerkin. His leather hideaway pouch, designed to be easy to access, lay against his skin. Not wasting any more time, Seth pushed the folded document into the pouch, drew the bone closure shut in one fluid movement, and, like a magic trick without the magic, the constellation scroll disappeared. His first task completed, Seth made to leave the cell, the siren song of his skin driving him ceaselessly towards his next destination. But even so, he stopped. One look at the sleeping boy made his neck ache. Exhaling in frustration, he turned back around, all the while fighting the ink burned into his scarred body, and gently lowered the boy onto the hard stone floor. There. It was bad enough that he was stealing from him, at least now Darcon wouldn't suffocate himself with his own chin. Seth peered out into the hallway and found it empty. He closed the door behind him, and all but ran from the cell, eager to get away from the residual magical signature of the sleeping sigil's detonation. As he went, his paranoia grew. Every shadow was a person, waiting to seize him, and every sound was a yell, an alarm being raised. When at last he was back outside, it was both a relief and a curse. The weather had deteriorated further. The clouds overhead seemed to boil in the sky, lighting up from within with sudden flashes of electricity and peppering the mountains with lances of bright light. Rain pounded the stony landscape. 3 minutes down, almost to the second. 7 to go. True, there was no guarantee Darcon would wake the exact moment the spell ended, but that was not a risk worth taking. The toothless wizard who had hawked him the glyph wasn't exactly the image of trust, and untaxed magic could hardly be considered dependable. Another bolt of lightning tore through the sky, leaving behind the stench of burnt air. Seth glanced around as he made his way back towards the observatory. A few of the disciples, finished with their meal and undeterred by the rain, were emerging from the dining hall to continue their activities out on the training grounds. Seth gave them a wide berth, sticking to the shadows where possible. He couldn't be too careful, not now that he'd come so far. As they had before, his tattoos sang with agony as he drew closer to the magic of the telescope room, the muscles in his neck standing out as he fought a losing battle with his own mottled skin. It took everything he had not to claw at his own flesh, to rend it from his bones and stumble away into the darkness in a last, pointless rebuttal of the body, and choice, that had been taken from him long ago. Instead, he listened to his blistering skin. The wedge-shaped observatory door stood open and waiting for him. It was a strange thing to be so physically repulsed by a place and yet so inescapably drawn to it at the same time. Seth did his best to project an air of cold confidence, to match the frigid rain, perhaps, as he strode across the threshold and into the massive chamber. He had learned long ago that nothing got you into a place more easily than acting like you had every right to be there. The lower level was empty as he had expected. What he hadn't been expecting was just how eerie the telescope room was when it was deserted. There was something at work here, no doubt about it, something that was incomprehensible to mortals. The telescope towered above him, its lens like a great eye, watching his every move. Every footstep boomed, every breath was like a gust of wind, and through it all, the unknowable vastness of the heavens above was never once lost on him. Seth tore his gaze from the telescope and glanced around, rubbing at his searing skin for a moment before finally settling on his second target. Next to the telescope stood a tiered series of circular platforms, and on the top level sat a large iron chest. The trunk was innocuous enough, easily overlooked amidst all the ornate murals and the giant spyglass, but its importance couldn't be overstated. Darting up the 2 short flights of stairs to the platform, Seth ducked under the telescope's protruding eyepiece, grimacing as the magic of the place threatened to tear him apart. He ran his fingers over the leather buckles, ignoring the fresh twinges of power that they sent up his hands and up his arms. There was a latch on the front of the chest, but to his surprise, it wasn't locked. Either the disciples' hubris had them thinking they were immune to theft, or the armillary box was inconspicuous enough to hide in plain sight. Either way, this was good news for Seth, who lifted the lid and peered into the trunk. Most of the contents were little more than junk. Old tomes, smaller models of the great telescope, replacement eyepieces of varying sizes, and several samples of meteorite ore and starstone, all of which were covered in strange sigils. Seth examined them instinctively. He could make out the runes for Nagus, Lennox, Yarrow, Sloke, Nyx, and dozens of other names. Perhaps these were trophies, representing great accomplishments that had earned the disciples renown throughout the temple. They would fetch a hefty price in the black market, but he wasn't here to make money. He continued to dig until he reached the bottom of the trunk, where a fist-sized metal cube sat amongst the other knickknacks. At first glance, the metal device looked a bit like a puzzle box. The frame was solid, hewn from aged, tarnished bronze and adorned with a glowing series of complicated sigils and star patterns. The sides were open, populated with layers of copper inserts that formed wire designs of moons and suns. Gears and wheels were visible in the gaps between them, controlled by some unknown mechanism deeper inside the box. Curious, Seth pushed on one of the side panels, and something clicked behind one of the copper moons. The plates switched out in a whir of turning gears, displaying a brand new constellation pattern. Would this quaint little cube finally put an end to it all? A flash of magic tore into his skin at that moment, and the box tumbled from his hands. It was enchanted, of course. Cursing himself for his own stupidity, Seth grabbed the first tome, within reach, full of hand-drawn star charts, and tore one of the large pages from the binding. Folding it in half, he used it to protect his skin as he fished the box back out of the trunk. He was in enough pain already and didn't want to risk draining whatever magic it had been imbued with. Shoving the cube unceremoniously into his hideaway pouch, he turned around and darted back down the stairs, ready to be on his way. only to find himself face to face with the small, dark-skinned girl he had encountered in the dormitory. He didn't know how long ago it had been. A telltale sign of the overwhelming magic of the place, and the surprise of seeing her had disrupted his mathematical mind. She was standing at the observatory entrance, her face drawn and her eyes narrowed and calculating. She was holding an armful of tools along with what might have been her own constellation scroll. "What in the starry skies are you doing?" she demanded, taking a step forward. Seth fumbled for an excuse, his mind racing. "I'm just exploring the temple while I wait." "You're not supposed to be in here unattended." The girl's gaze darted from Seth to the open chest behind him, and her expression twisted in indignation. "What did you take?" she demanded, her voice frighteningly adult in its accusation as she stared Seth down. No small feat considering he towered over her. Her eyes grew wide with sudden horror as some terrible possibility occurred to her. "Where's Darcon? You said he was in his room. Did you do something to him?" She clenched her fists, the hum of divine magic beginning to fill the air. Seth thought he saw something akin to disbelief flicker across the girl's soft features, but then it was gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. Beyond her lay his only escape, and Darcon would be raising the alarm the moment he woke. There was no explaining this one away, and with the initiate between him and the way out, he could do only one thing. Ignoring the prickling of his flesh, he cast back into his arsenal of spells, pulling from the well of energy in his skin as he performed the required gestures. A simple burst of kinetic force would do the trick. He couldn't afford to draw more attention than he already had. Summoning the magic was painful, but he did his best to ignore it. 1, he counted. 2, but before he could build a spell for the requisite 3 seconds, the girl was already lunging forward, sprinting at him with a speed that a mountain lion would envy. One moment she was on the other side of the room, and the next, she was on him. Dropping her supplies to the floor with a clatter, his focus faltered as did his disguise, and before he knew what was happening, the girl's hands were locked around his arms in a paralyzing grip. Divine power rippled from her in crashing waves, different from what Seth had sensed in the training yard, or even what he could sense here in the telescope room. There was some other kind of magic at work here, sinister and powerful, snuffing out his own spell like a candle consumed by darkness. It was denser, more resonant, and despite his size and bulky athleticism, Seth found himself unable to move. "Get off," he growled, knowing the command was useless. She seemed as surprised by her power as he was. "No," she replied in a voice that was aggravatingly calm and somehow distant. "Let me go," Seth warned her again. "I don't want to hurt you." She could only have been 90 pounds soaking wet, but somehow the girl began to drag him toward the exit. He dug his heels in, only for her to rap a knee against his shin, breaking his stance. "I'm taking you to the elders," she replied, still in that eerily tranquil tone. "They'll contact the magistrate, probably the conjurer too, if you don't have a permit for that spell." There was something terrifying in her eyes, a look of faraway communion with some unknown force. But that wasn't what sent a lance of fear through Seth. He was already falling behind in his search, and his tattoos would not accept failure. If he was taken back to the magistrate, it was all over. No, Seth thought, pulling back. His freedom had already been stripped away, as had his agency, his dignity, his very body. He would die before he gave up now. Panic surging through him, he began to thrash in the girl's grip, but she had something, or someone, on her side, and she managed to keep him from wiggling free. "I need help in the observatory," she yelled, glancing toward the open door. "There's an intruder!" But the pounding rain drowned out her call, buying Seth the precious seconds he needed. He was no martial artist, but he'd been in more than a few fights in his day. Seizing his chance while she was looking the other way, he lashed out at her legs with his foot. Startled, she lost her balance, giving him the opening he needed to charge forward. He knocked her onto her back, breaking her concentration and interrupting the flow of whatever incomprehensible force was powering her. Her grip loosened. Seth tore his arms free and stumbled backward, nearly colliding with a nearby desk. The girl righted herself quickly, closing the distance between them with a flying kick that struck Seth squarely in the middle of his chest. The air went out of his lungs in a whoosh, and as he gasped for breath, she landed a second blow to the same area, this time with the palm of her hand. A fresh pulse of pain shot through his torso, and rather fittingly considering where they were, he saw stars. Seth struggled to his feet, his ears ringing just as she kneed him in the side. Another blow struck him in the collarbone, and another in his stomach. She was too quick for him to keep up, so he retreated, skittering back across the marble floor. The girl squared her shoulders, and that uncanny absent look returned to her eyes. The familiar feeling of blossoming magic attacked Seth from every angle as the same strange, unknown energy crescendoed around her once more. Panicking, he did the only thing he could think of. He reached for her face with his open hand, moving his fingers as he'd been taught, praying that his skin would sap enough energy from her to take her out of the fight. Perhaps anticipating another blow, the girl grabbed his fingers, and that was when it happened. The power Seth had sensed building around her seemed to get away from her. Freed from its corporal restraints, it pulsed out of her for a second. Just one, but one was enough. This wasn't like the fire of his skin. It was colder than cold, insidious, seeping into every pore. In the brief moment, Seth could have sworn he saw a corona of smoky darkness radiating out from the girl's body. Then it was all over. Her magic clashed with Seth's, prompting a blinding pulse of force that expanded out in a thunderous ring. The power of it knocked the wind from Seth's lungs, sending him flying one way, and the girl the other. The world whirled past him for a second, end over end, and then his back slammed hard into the far wall. Gasping in pain, he opened his eyes just in time to see the girl crash directly into the base of the giant telescope. She lay there, unmoving, and didn't get back up. Chapter 7. Mina. Later, after it was all over, Mina would remember the magic. She would never recall if there had been any incantation, nor would she be able to make any kind of guess as to what infernal power had radiated through the trespasser's skin. But she would always remember this sensation. It was like grabbing the handle of a hot skillet, a kind of shock that set her nerves alight and rocketed up her arm to some primal part of her brain. And just like grabbing a hot skillet, her first urge was to recoil, to yank her hand away. But there was no withdrawing from this. It had seized hold of her, stopping her dead in her tracks, dragging her down like a snaring vine. Even as it tore through her body, it drove through her skin and bones, biting into her flesh and lacing her body with an overwhelming heaviness, the kind that you felt after being awake for days at a time. No, that was wrong. She wasn't being weighed down. She was being drained. It seemed to suck the life right out of her, pulling the strength from her body like water from a well. It all happened in the space of less than a second, but she was acutely aware of that depleting feeling, like being sanguinated, except no blood spilled forth, only energy. Terror followed, sharp and sour. The divine power that she had summoned with a taunting and beautiful melody rushed forth in a torrent. Her knees buckled, her eyes flying open as she lost control of the tenuous connection. Something's wrong, she thought. But that was all she had time for. Power exploded through her, out of her, and into the stranger. And then, inevitably, out into the room. The tiles split under their feet as a pulse of energy boomed through Mina's chest. Then she was flying away from the intruder at top speed, the observatory spinning around her, until it wasn't. She struck something hard and pain erupted in her head, so intense that it blocked out all light and sound. The world grew dull before her eyes. And although she was once again on solid ground, she barely noticed. Agony consumed her, and when her consciousness dimmed, it was a blessing. Time ceased to have meaning. She felt as though she were standing between two worlds, the solid one, cold and hard beneath her, and an ethereal one, made of decay and darkness. Her vision returned, gray and halting, as if she were looking at the observatory through a thick cloud of smog. Through the haze, she caught sight of the thief hurrying to the door, barely sparing her a glance as he prepared to flee into the rain. Her vision came and went, eventually fading away completely. Darkness, like death, filled her eyes, dense and impenetrable. The pain was back, oh yes. It bored through her skull, setting her head on fire like someone was jamming burning needles into her eye sockets. She was pretty sure she screamed, but she couldn't hear anything. The pain drowned out all else. It roared through her like an inferno, and it didn't stop, not even when her vision came back and a silent scene unfolded before her eyes. It was the thief, the dark-haired intruder. Except it wasn't him, not the way he had been just moments ago. He was cast in shades of pitch black and harsh white, like the blur that lingered after looking at the sun. He was older, too, his hair longer and shot through with white near the temples. Standing in front of him, its massive wings outstretched, was a celestial dragon unlike any other. It looked down on the man with eyes that blazed like white fire. Its horns were enormous, straight instead of curved, and although constellations swirled within its towering body, they did not match any that currently existed. The dragon turned its burning eyes on Mina, and for a moment, she thought she saw recognition in its gaze. Then it returned its attention to the thief, opening its jaws. What came out was not dragon fire. It was pure destruction, waves of crashing gravity, as inescapable as the paths of the planets. Darkness, the likes of which had only existed before the first celestial bodies had formed, poured forth, shot through with starlight from all the heavens. The maelstrom shot through the thief's body, consuming him, tearing him apart, cleaving him from the universe as though he had never existed at all. Abruptly, the hallucination ended, and Mina's mind fell into a darkness of its own. Chapter 8. Seth. Seth's breath came in great whooping gasps as he fought to sit up. Across the room, the girl had gone as limp as a rag doll, but terror coursed through him all the same. There was no way the chaos of their fight hadn't drawn attention, raging storm outside or not. Still struggling to gain his balance, Seth grunted and staggered to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision swimming. For a moment, he battled for equilibrium, straining to hear anything other than the hard rain and bracing himself for the inevitable flood of angry disciples. But there was nothing. No voices came from the courtyard, no shouts of confusion or panic. There was only the steady drumbeat of the torrential rain. Disconnected from himself, Seth stumbled past the circular dais on unsteady legs. A sense of unreality threatened to overtake him as he approached the girl, and his stomach dropped when he saw what had become of her. She had a nasty wound at the back of her head, and a pool of blood was already spreading out beneath her battered body. He couldn't tell if her chest was moving, and more blood trickled out the side of her mouth. Guilt. Cold, merciless, and tinged with fear, clamped down on Seth's chest and didn't let go, not even as he knelt and raised the back of his hand to her nose. Careful not to make contact with her, that would surely kill her, if she wasn't dead already. Seth counted the seconds and prayed. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth, a whisper of air brushed the back of his battered knuckles. Exhaling in relief, Seth pulled his hand away, checking the exit once more. It wouldn't be long before someone missed her, and there were pupils out in the courtyard. That was the worst part of it. Despite the horror of what he had done, he was already itching to leave, itching to write this off as an unfortunate tragedy. The cost of doing business. Damn them, he thought. Damn these ruined tattoos and their bastardized magic. Most of all, though, he damned their incessant whispering in his head. The voice that never went away, the sick compulsion that made him give up his agency and his humanity. A single glance down at the burns that broke up the sigils was enough to make him feel ill. As he knelt there, crippled by sudden self-loathing, the girl's eyelids fluttered. Seth froze, staring at her, and when her eyes opened, he saw just how grave her injury was. The whites were muddled with blood, wild and staring. Her mouth opened and closed, a gurgling rasp tearing through her throat. But there was something else, something worse. Fear. The fear written on her face sent a shiver through Seth's mottled skin. It was a kind of fear the likes of which he had only experienced once before in his life. A primal horror that made clerics pray for mercy and prophets weep. Terrible things lurked in those glassy depths. Memory came to him, unbidden. So real that his tattoos gave a fresh surge of burning pain that had nothing to do with the magic within the monastery. Fire licking up cloth, making it curl, skin burning everywhere they had applied the oil, tendrils of rancid smoke drifting slowly into the air. It was reflected in their eyes he could never forget, and it was mixed with a kind of madness. Was it really a memory? Was it a dream? Was the madness theirs, or his own? Did it matter? Seth tore his eyes from the wounded girl, shrinking away. He struggled to get to his feet, stumbled, and tried again. Fear made him frantic, wild, like an animal, as he lurched back toward the entrance, his scarred skin a sheath of magic-absorbing fire. It was only as he emerged from the observatory that whatever rational part of him remained reminded him where he was. Through the downpour came the faint voices of the students on their meal break, and he forced himself to slow down. It wouldn't do to draw attention. His markings burned with agitated urgency, and it took all his self-control not to break into a sprint. Sticking to the far walls, Seth counted his footsteps. It was the only thing he could do. 50 paces brought him to the training yards, where he could finally see a group of initiates through the curtain of rain. There were only 6 of them, but that was 6 too many. Feeling exposed, drenched with rain and his own sweat, Seth pushed forward, hardly daring to look in their direction. But that didn't keep them from looking at him. Seth's blood ran cold, his breath hitching in his throat as he froze in his path. One of the initiates, a tall, muscular girl, was facing his direction, and she was staring right at him. He froze, paralyzed with fear. Please, he prayed, as if he could make it through that thought alone. Don't see me against the wall. Let me be a rain-soaked shadow. Look away, please, please, look away. The moment seemed to stretch on into infinity, disciple and thief staring at one another from across the training grounds. It lasted so long that Seth was sure he'd been made. His quest ended here, and it had all been for nothing. But then the girl's partner said something to her, and she looked away, returning her attention to her drills. Seth blew out a breath as he made his escape. 100 paces brought him to the outskirts of the monastery. 130 would bring him to the gates. His pulse raced. Blood pounded in his temples, and not even his aching skin could distract him from the adrenaline. The image of the small girl in the observatory flashed before him, the blood behind her head, her eyes, seeing things that should not be seen. Seth stumbled, his ankle rolling painfully under him. His nerves were getting away from him, and when he saw the 2 guards from earlier taking shelter from the rain under the portcullis, he was ready to scream. "Where are Darcon and Nagus?" the woman guard asked him, as he passed through the gate. Seth gave her a smile that was more like a grimace. "Back at their drills, I would imagine. I was just leaving. My job here is done." That much, at least, was true. The guard eyed him incredulously, for longer than was comfortable. Had she already caught wind that something was afoot? But the male guard didn't seem fazed. "May the stars light your path," he said, giving Seth a brisk nod. "Yours as well," the thaumaturge replied, not waiting for further dismissal. Moments later, he was past the gate. 90 more paces brought Seth back to the mountain path. As soon as he was out of sight of the temple, he began to sprint down the rain-slicked stairs, not caring if he dashed himself to pieces in a fall off the side. Perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Heart in his throat, Seth made his frantic descent, listening all the while for the inevitable shouts of the disciples above. Chapter 9. Mina. The pain was consuming and inescapable, like a spike of frozen steel through her head, and it was all the worse when she was awake. She didn't know whether it was day or night. As her brief bouts of consciousness became more frequent, the only thing she was sure of was that she was no longer in the observatory. Someone must have found her in there, bleeding on the floor, and brought her to the infirmary. She now lay on a thin cot, listening to the sounds of Elder Sloke's breath rattling in and out of his decrepit chest. Mistress Geraldine was holding a damp cloth to her forehead, her voice sounding as if it were coming from the end of a long tunnel. She was speaking to Master Disciple Lennox, Elder Nix, and Elder Sloke, who was presumably still unable to leave his own sickbed. Elder Snowthorn was also there, his voice creaking and hoarse with slumber. "I thought he was hibernating," Mina thought feverishly. "She's running a fever," Geraldine pronounced as she dabbed at the flushed, sweaty skin beneath the rag, "and it's only getting worse." "You woke me for this, Lennox?" Snowthorn demanded in a groggy voice. "Just to tell me a junior initiate bumped her head?" "Don't be a glib, Snowthorn." It was an older female speaking, most likely Elder Nix. "You'll have to forgive my mood," Snowthorn replied, but there wasn't much remorse in it. "I've just had my hibernation cut 2 months short." The significance of this was not lost on Mina, even through the haze. The effort required to pull a tundra elf from their annual slumber was nothing short of extraordinary, like trying to awaken a corpse. If they had gone to the trouble of rousing Elder Snowthorn, then that meant something terrible has happened. That was the only clear thought to go through her mind. "You heard Geraldine," Elder Nix said, her walking stick scraping against the floor as her voice drew closer to Mina. "This is no ordinary injury." "Indeed," the healer affirmed. "My treatments aren't working. Something has to be done, or she'll die." Lennox's distress was obvious. "What we need right now is decisive action," he said. We've never had an accident like this before." Elder Snowthorn was silent for a long moment. "Can't you give her something else?" he suggested at last, sounding immensely tired. "Willow bark, maybe." "Haven't you been listening?" Geraldine replied. "That's what I've been doing. Lemon balm, too, and salts for the pain." "Then we just have to wait until the fever breaks," Elder Nix reasoned, although her steely voice was tinged with doubt. "We've waited for a day and a half, and it's only gotten worse," Mistress Geraldine argued. "Besides, the fever is only part of the problem. Even if it breaks on its own, there's still the head injury to consider." "Then treat it," Snowthorn snapped. "Don't you think I would if I could?" Mistress Geraldine demanded. "The problem is inside her skull. I can't see what's going on. I can only guess. And even if I knew exactly what I was dealing with, I wouldn't be able to treat it." "Why not?" came Elder Sloke's reply. "Herbs won't solve this," the healer replied. "It will likely take a healing spell, or at the very least, magical ingredients, and we don't have either up here." Elder Snowthorn heaved a sigh. "Stop looking at me, Geraldine. You know I can't think clearly when I'm awakened early. I can't be asked to problem solve." "There must be a mage somewhere down the mountains," Sloke interjected. "A mage, yes," Mistress Geraldine agreed. "A mage with healing magic. Those are as rare as lightning on a clear night. The best we'll find is some slapdash magician who does more harm than good." Mina wanted to cry out in protest. They were talking about her as if she weren't there, as if she weren't shrouded in pain and blindness, and waiting to die. No. Worse. They were talking about her as if she were already dead. She wanted to leap out of her cot and find a healer herself if she had to, but she remained as she was, still, silent, and in pain. Master Disciple Lennox had started to pace. "What about the augurs, then?" he demanded. "Their magic is centuries old. Maybe they could arrange something, a ritual perhaps, or some kind of potion. They'll know the right herbs, if nothing else." "Be reasonable, Lennox," Geraldine replied. "They have no reason to help us." "There is the boy, Darcon," Elder Sloke pointed out, his voice weaker than ever before. Mina could picture him lying there, wasting away, and her heart went out to him, even through her own pain. "His brother is an augur in training. Perhaps they would be more amendable than you think." "We don't have time to wait," the healer said. "Even if the augurs were willing to help, a babblebird would still need to locate them in order to get them a message. How long will that take? 3 days? 5? I can't guarantee I can keep her alive that long." "But the longer we wait, the worse her chances get," Geraldine stated, her tone brokering no argument. "We have to do something now. I believe the problem is swelling inside her head. This is no normal concussion, and although her skull didn't break, something is putting pressure on her brain." "What?" Elder Snowthorn asked. There was a pause. "Fluid would be my guess," the healer replied. "That's the most dangerous thing. If we can drain it, then she might stabilize." "Trephination?" Elder Nix sounded appalled. "Do you even have the skills for that?" "What kind of healer do you think I am?" Mistress Geraldine demanded. "I'm not saying it isn't dangerous. It's a gamble, and it's as likely to kill her as it is to save her. But it might be our only option. If we don't act now, she could end up blind, and that's if she doesn't die first." She could end up blind. The words echoed in Mina's pounding head as like a curse. She could end up blind. "No," Lennox spoke up, and Mina could almost see her mentor shaking his head. "No, I won't allow it." "What other choice do we have?" "There has to be something. You can't just expect to—" Amidst the others bickering about her fate, Mina at last found her voice. Groping forward, she seized Mistress Geraldine's chubby wrist and struggled to sit up in bed. Although she couldn't see anything more than washed-out colors, she stared in what she hoped was the direction of the woman's face. "Do it," she croaked. "Mina?" Elder Sloke said, surprised. "You're awake." "I am," Mina replied, each word taking immense effort. "And I'm telling you to do it. Drain the pressure. It feels like my head is going to split open if you don't." "Mina," Lennox said, touching her hand. "I don't think you realize the severity of—" Mina gritted her teeth. "Do it," her instructor insisted, and for the first time in all her years of knowing him, Mina could have sworn Master Disciple Lennox sounded afraid. "I would rather die than lose my sight," she replied. Her voice was so calm that it surprised even her, level enough to conceal the fear that boiled beneath it. It wasn't the fear of blindness itself that had her stomach roiling and her anxiety raging. It wasn't the fear of darkness, or even the fear that she would no longer be able to stargaze. It was an image forcing itself into her pain-ridden mind, a tiny, crippled beggar woman who shambled like a skeleton up and down Weaver's Row back in Ten Keeps. In the memory, the woman's filthy hair hung around her shoulders, where it had already fallen out in clumps. Her face was gaunt and haunted, and the look of withdrawn resignation in her sunken eyes had stayed with Mina ever since she left the Civil Lands. She doubted she would ever be free of it. She was afraid to die. Of course she was. But the only thing worse than being dead was being half alive. "Please," she rasped. They listened. The infirmary was as quiet as ashes on a breeze. Mistress Geraldine hurried to and fro, fetching tools and opening cupboards. Mina's heart raced madly as she thought of what was about to happen. Skull-boring had always seemed barbaric to her, but now it might very well be the only thing that stood between her and a fate she dared not ponder. At last, Mistress Geraldine returned to her bedside. Wordlessly, she moved Mina's aching head to one side. After cleaning the area above her ear, she used a grease stick to mark the incision site before retreating to another cabinet. "I'm preparing some vapors for you," she informed Mina as she finished up. "I won't lie, though. Even with them dulling your senses, this will be painful." "I don't care." "All the same," the healer replied. "You're going to want this, believe me." There was a sound of flint on steel, a waft of smoke, and Mistress Geraldine had something under Mina's nose. The young woman breathed deeply of the acrid fumes, and with moments, the sensation in her head grew muted. Mina relaxed, even as the healer set to work with the trephine. Metal scraped against bone, warm blood ran down her neck, and despite the salts, there was pain, as sharp and intense as a knife to the head, which seemed fitting, considering the drill biting into her bone. Fluid flowed, and it kept flowing. The trickle became a river, and then a flood, and Mina was aware on some level that she was floating away from her body. Geraldine was taking too much, far too much, but the vapors had robbed her of her ability to speak. "Wait, stop," she wanted to cry. "You're bleeding me dry! You're killing me!" But the blood didn't stop pouring forth, not even when Mina's eyes rolled back in her head, her breathing rapid and shallow. Gone went her breath, her heartbeat, all coherent thought, and then she was teetering on the brink of death. A pit of blackest night. She drifted in the darkness for what could have been hours or minutes. It was infinite, an endless ocean, and just when she was sure she was well and truly lost, sure that she would spend the rest of eternity in this void, she sensed a presence. There was a figure in the darkness. It stood somewhere out in front of her, somehow both close and immensely far away. Its form was hard to distinguish from the blackness that surrounded it, and it seemed as though it was clad in smoke rather than fabric. The figure didn't move. It just stared out into the darkness at something Mina could neither see nor comprehend. "Who are you?" she asked, and although she could hear the words echoing in the field of darkness, she never felt her lips move. The figure stood still for an endless moment, its robes shifting slowly around its body, although there was no breeze to stir them. At last, it raised its head, sending a hazy ripple out through the void, but it did not turn around or give any acknowledgement that it had understood her. Mina stared at it, feeling as though she were watching a scene unfold from far outside herself. Curiosity, not fear, was what prompted her to speak up again. "Who are you?" she repeated, still unsure whether the words were really coming from her mouth. The figure turned around, but there was no movement in its legs or body, nothing to delineate where it ended and the void began. One moment it was facing away from her, the next it was facing toward her, and the sight of it was equal parts eerie and mystifying. Although its body had a vaguely humanoid shape, its face was not a face at all, but a skull, the skull of a jackal. It stared at her from within its hooded shroud, paralyzing her with its gaze. But still, it remained silent. "What are you?" Perhaps it was a stupid question, irrelevant to what she was experiencing, but she asked it nonetheless, if only to keep the encroaching silence at bay. "I am the end." The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, outside her and around her and within her. Although the jackal being didn't open its mouth, Mina had no doubt it was the source of the words, which seemed to reverberate in her head like an ancient chant. "The end of what?" The figure was quiet for a while, nothing but darkness in its eye sockets. "The end that comes for everything and everyone," it replied at last. "I am that which drives oceans and turns mountains to dust. I watch I wait, and when I am ready, I take." "Take what?" Mina asked, surprised to discover that she was unafraid. The figure didn't respond. She stood under its hollow gaze until she could stand the silence no longer, and although something within her was telling her she should feel nothing but panic, it was muted, dulled somehow, replaced by a feeling she couldn't name. Confusion? Awe? There was no word for it. "What do you want from me?" "I have felt your eyes on me," the figure responded. "You walk in the darkness. You reach for what you cannot understand." "Then make me understand," Mina protested, emboldened and a little frustrated. "Explain why you've brought me here, wherever here is. Either that, or send me back to where I was." There was a brief moment when she worried she had angered the being, but it didn't react. It continued to stare at her, out of the black pits in its skull. Those pits seemed to bore into her, worming their way into her heart and her mind and very soul, examining her with a detached clinical gaze. They were searching for something, perhaps something buried so far within her that not even she was aware of it. "As you wish," the being said, and then she was hurtling backward, flung away into the dark as the figure receded before her eyes. Unmoored, she floated, the emptiness swallowing her up, and she couldn't be sure of anything until the stirrings of a familiar sensation began to encroach on the blackness. Pain. The fumes were wearing off, and the outside world seeped back in. As her discomfort increased, so did her awareness, and she realized that someone was speaking from far above her. "Mina, can you hear me?" Mistress Geraldine asked. She sucked in a breath, but her mouth was as dry as paper. The throbbing pressure in her skull had abated, replaced by a more precise point of pain just above her left ear. There was a scraping sound, the tearing of bandages, and the slathering of some kind of poultice over the wound. Blessedly cold, if slimy. She tried to ask what had happened, but the only sound that came from her parched throat was a rattling rasp. "Don't try to talk, and definitely don't move," Mistress Geraldine cautioned her. "I'm rubbing your head now. You gave me quite the scare back there." Mina swallowed a dry bit of nothing, and took a shivering breath. "What?" she whispered. "I relieved some of the pressure on your brain," Mistress Geraldine explained, as matter-of-factly, as if she had given her a haircut, and not bored a hole in her head. "You were screaming so much I had to give you more vapors. And there was something else happening." The healer fell silent for a moment, her hands lingering on Mina's head. "I've never seen anything like it. Here, lean forward for me." She eased Mina's head off the pillow to finish wrapping the bandage, and the sudden jab of pain to her temple made Mina's eyes fly open. She hadn't thought she would miss the darkness. How wrong she was. The haze was gone. The shapes of the infirmary were no longer blurred. Mistress Geraldine's wrinkled face stared warily down at her as she tied off the bandage. But although Mina could see her clearly now, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. First, she became aware of a terrible sense of dizziness that made her stomach heave with fresh nausea. Then, in an instant, she was brought screaming back to that in-between from before, that knife's edge on which she had stood between consciousness and waking, between life and death. On one side was the world as she knew it, with Sloke and Mistress Geraldine and Elder Hawthorne all watching with bated breath. And on the other was oblivion. Oblivion and the being that dwelled there. Except Mina wasn't in either place. She stood trapped between them, one foot in the land of the living and one foot in the vast, black night. As she stared, trying to find meaning in the chaos, she now saw. It was like looking through a window of black frosted glass. On the other side, Mistress Geraldine was putting away the tremphine in blood-soaked gauze. But a shadow lurked behind her. The colors were hazy and monochrome, like the nightmare she'd had of the celestial dragon and the thief that had injured her. But there was no dragon this time. In the shimmering blur, the healer stood, barely recognizable on the steep stairway leading from the temple to the base of the mountain. The slope dwarfed her stout frame, and she seemed to be in a hurry as she shuffled down the stone steps. Then she was losing her balance, her feet flying out from under her as she went plummeting down the steep staircase, disappearing into the fog surrounding the mountainside. "Mistress Geraldine!" Mina screamed, shooting up in bed despite the roaring discomfort in her head. She was suddenly freezing cold instead of feverish, and for a moment the vertigo was so intense that she thought she would pass out. "Are you all right?" the healer asked, turning back to her. Not dead, not falling, not rendered in shades of black and gray, but over her, the smoky mountain loomed, ominous and ethereal. "You," Mina began, but then Elder Nink shuffled forward, her cane meeting the tiles with light taps, and it happened again. A shadow, like ink, dropped in water, even as a stone-faced woman put a hand to Mina's shoulder. Her monochrome doppelganger, somehow even blacker than the one of Geraldine, was lying down in bed. Her skin was as wrinkled and leathery as a prune, and she wore a look of blissful contentment on her face. Her hair was no longer gray, but white, and her shallow breathing subsided slowly as she sank deeper into a cloud of blankets. Old age, Mina knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. Not a bad way to go in the end. "Mina, what is it?" Elder Nix asked, still very much alive, her hand still on Mina's shoulder, and posed over her was her shadowy twin, still lying dead in bed. "Stop bothering her by the starry skies. Look at her. She's terrified." She recognized Elder Sloke's voice with a mixture of relief and dread, and when she followed Nix's gaze, she was greeted by a third vision. This one was the worst of them all, because it was also the clearest. Not smudged at all, not wispy and foggy. Solid, tangible, so real she could almost touch it. A duplicate drawn in darkness, and it too whispered of mortality. Sloke was in the same bed, his real body now occupied, all skin and bones as he stared out the window at the night sky. He too was peaceful, until a look of sudden terror overtook him, his mouth dropping open and his face going deathly pale. He gasped, flailing about like a fish on land. His chest rose and fell in search of a breath that he couldn't take, and for several agonizing moments he fought, but it was a fight he was never going to win. The apparition collapsed into his pillows, his arms falling limply to one side, and he was still. His wasting disease had finally claimed him, as they had all known it would. They're going to die, Mina thought, and in spite of her panic, the notion was surprisingly clear, a terrifying kernel of sanity amidst the madness that surrounded her. They're all going to die, but Sloke will be the first. Next week, maybe. Tomorrow, perhaps. Or tonight. The certainty in it was somehow both reassuring and revolting. It couldn't be. Not Sloke, not the old man had been so kind to her through everything. It couldn't be. She was having a terror, not a premonition. Except when she tore her eyes from the old man, she found herself looking once more at Nix, standing tall and yet not, the specter of mortality hanging over her like a ghost as she fell back against pillows that did not exist and died. A blink of Mina's eyes brought the elder back, staring at her with a concerned look from across the sick room, but the shadow was still there, obscuring her vision of Nix, playing on repeat in a diabolical pantomime. Not dead. Dead. Not dead yet. Dead of old age. No, it's not possible. Yes, it is. What am I seeing? No, no, no. An anguished moan bubbled up in Mina's throat, and she looked away, feeling like a voyeur. But there was no respite to be found in Geraldine. There she was again, hazy, her chubby arms pinwheeling madly as she missed that fateful step on the mountainside and tumbled down, 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 head over heels, breaking bone after bone, until her neck gave way. Mina's mind rebelled against the inevitability, but she was a voyeur, watching through that invisible barrier as the worst came to pass, helpless to stop it, helpless to look away, helpless to do anything but wait for that darkness. Heart hammering in her chest, breath rushing into her lungs in a great gasp. Mina wrenched away from the paralysis. She reeled backwards, kicking her feet out wildly and sending the blankets falling to the floor. Her head connected with the wall and sent a fresh burst of pain through her battered skull, but even that dulled in the shadow of her panic. Prying her gaze from the others in the room, Mina craned her neck, her eyes rolling in her head like a mad cow's. The vertigo was back, and this time it brought nausea with it, a great wave of sickness that had her spine distorting, and her hands trembling. When she at last tumbled out of bed and landed painfully on the cold marble floor, her suffering eyes found the broad bay windows on the west side of the infirmary. She began to scream harder. Although it was night, and the sky was dark and clear, she couldn't see the stars. Somewhere in the room, Mistress Geraldine was calling out to her, alarmed, but the healer couldn't help her. She existed on the other side of the tenebrous barrier, and not even her hands on Mina's shoulders could bring back the light. She thrashed madly, aware that she was screaming, her throat raw but not caring, flinging the healer's arms away as she flailed like she was drowning. And in a way, she was drowning. drowning in death.